And now I would like to introduce today's special guest. It is my sincere pleasure as President of the Canadian Club of Toronto to introduce a discussion on leadership today. In our information age, those we consider our leaders, be it in politics, business, or other spheres of society, are subject to intense and constant scrutiny. We question them and their actions on a daily basis, and they often seem to fall well short of our expectations. So what are the qualities of a true leader? Throughout history, statesmen, conquerors, and prophets have offered up their own definitions. Napoleon Bonaparte called a leader a dealer in hope. US President Harry Truman said, "Leadership is the ability to get people to do what they don't want to do and like it." And the great comedian Lucille Ball described leaders as those who both understood what they couldn't do equally as well as what they could do. Today's speaker has recently published a novel on the life of one of history's most influential leaders, the Buddha, a prince who renounced everything, power, privilege, and family, to become one of the greatest spiritual leaders of the past 2,000 years. On his way to becoming a leader, Buddha had to overcome many temptations and do a lot of looking inward at himself. But I don't want to give away too much of the story for those who don't know it. I will leave this to our guest in the pages of his terrific new book, which will be on sale after lunch. This is the beautiful book. Instead, I want to say a few words about our speaker himself. Deepak Chopra was born in India and raised as a medical doctor. Over the past 20-plus years, he has published more than 40 books, become one of the most respected leaders in the world in the field of mind-body medicine, and been recognized as one of the top 100 heroes and icons of the 20th century by Time magazine. Indians recognize him as one of the historically greatest ambassadors to the West, and his influence in terms of how we view health and wellness continues to grow. Today, Deepak will speak on the soul of leadership, a topic he's touched on in many of his books and speeches and in the courses he's taught at places like Stanford University and the Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern University. Who better to tackle this challenging topic than someone who has devoted his career to leading, whether as a doctor, an author, or a teacher, or in the giving of his time to important causes like the Alliance for a New Humanity or the opening of the Wall of Peace at the Canadian Museum of Hindu Civilization right here in Richmond Hill this weekend. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with profound pleasure that I invite today's speaker to the podium. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deepak Chopra.
Thank you, Noella, and thank you all for being here. It's a great privilege to speak to you today on this topic, the soul of leadership, but I thought I'll cover a few other things as well as we go along. We have a little bit of time because a lot of you are probably wondering what a medical doctor trained in internal medicine and endocrinology, what kind of business does he have to be talking about the soul of leadership and writing about the life of the Buddha. So I just want to give you a little background. I went to medical school in India, and by the time I finished, the Vietnam War was coming to an end in the United States, and there was a shortage of physicians, so we were all being invited to train in advanced medicine in the US, but also, of course, we were also being seen as good, inexpensive labor. So I finished my training, rather my medical school degree in India, and took a flight in 1970 to the US. And at that time, you could not leave the country with more than $8 in your pocket because of foreign exchange regulations. I had an uncle in London, and he lent me $100, so now I had $108, which, if you know anything about Hindu mythology, is a very auspicious number. So I thought I should do something really auspicious with it, and I went to Paris and blew it all in one night at the Moulin Rouge. It was one of the most memorable experiences of my life. When I got to New York, I had nothing, zero. But I'd heard of this great American custom. America is very creative in its innovations and customs. And this one was called a collect call. So I made a collect call from the airport to my hospital administrator, and I said, if you need a doctor, you'll have to pick me up. And they were so desperate that they sent me a helicopter. So my first experience of the United States was lifting off a helicopter around twilight and looking out of the window and seeing the skyline of Manhattan. And I thought maybe I was in the wrong place. I thought this was Disney World, or what my imagination thought Disney World would be like. Well, shortly thereafter, we got to a little town called Plainfield, New Jersey. I reported to my hospital, and the nurse told me that my first rotation was going to be in the emergency room, and that I should just go to the dorm and get some rest, because when it got busy, it would get very busy. So I went to the dorm and I switched on the television set, and at that time in India there was no TV. And so first of all, this was my first experience of television. Moreover, it was in color. So I was totally captivated and totally mesmerized. I was watching Wimbledon on the television set in color when the program was interrupted with the news bulletin. And there had been a shootout at a local bank. What's new? This morning I look at the news and we're still talking about shootouts. In many ways, nothing has changed in the last 35 years or more. But anyway, there had been a shootout at the local bank. Some policemen had been wounded, and they were being brought to the emergency room where I was going to be doing my rotation. And the fact of the matter was that even though I had passed all my exams, I'd actually never seen a patient. So I had my first attack of what seems to be a very common syndrome, particularly in the United States, acute panic. But I stood there, watched television, waited to be called, and finally the nurse did call me, and she said, Dr. Chopra, we have an expiration. I had no idea what that word meant, but of course I didn't want to let on, so I said, you bet, I'll be there. And putting on my best attitude, I bounded down the stairs, and I told the nurse, I said, I'm here. And she took me to a room where there was a dead body, lots of machines, no people. Where I came from, there were usually lots of people and no machines. So I looked at this person who was no longer alive, and I looked at the nurse and I said, he's dead. She said, I told you, we had an expiration. So finally I knew what the word meant, the opposite of what presumably we're here for, inspiration. And I said to her, I said, if the patient is already dead, why do you need a doctor? And she said, pronounce him. And I knew I was in another dimension of consciousness where your soul couldn't leave your body till a medical deity, otherwise known as MD, said, you're free to go now. I release you. But modern doctors are like ancient shamans. We don't wear leopard skins. We wear white coats. We don't have feathers around our neck. We have a stethoscope. We don't chant Aborigine mantras, we chant Latin mantras. And we don't dance around a fire, we dance around a CAT scanner. And we have our rituals as well. So even in the face of the obvious, we do our thing. So I thought I should check the pupils and do the usual. And having trained in English, which is somewhat similar, I believe, to Canadian English, although Canadian English is getting corrupted too, I asked the nurse for a torch, which of course is the English word for a flashlight. And she looked at me and she said, "A what?" I said, "A torch." So by this time there were lots of people outside the emergency room watching on this very melodramatic scene. And my nurse looked at the nurse outside and she said, "He wants a torch." And she looked at me, and then she looked at me again, and then she said, "Maybe he wants to do a cremation." So it was a bit of a rocky start. I call it the dark night, or my dark night in New Jersey. Well, it took me 6 hours, literally no more than 6 hours, to actually feel very high, to be addicted to the adrenaline rush of the emergency room. In fact, after 6 hours, I was looking forward to the next trauma patient, and I didn't care if they had any suffering. I didn't care what their life was all about. I didn't even care who they were. All I wanted was to practice my newly discovered surgical skills. And in fact, the more grievously they were wounded, the better for me. Within 24 hours, the nurse told me, she said, "If you don't leave this room now, you are going to pass out. So you should go and rest." But I didn't want to leave. I had discovered my new addiction. And so finally she turned me out of the emergency room. I went back to my dorm. And of course I couldn't sleep. I was so high. Finally I left the dorm and I went to Main Street, Plainfield. And I stood outside a television store where they had 40 different color TVs in the window, all showing different programs. So I stood outside and watched television, Main Street, Plainfield. A little while later, a salesman came out and he said, "You really like those, don't you?" I said, "I do. I've never seen television. Moreover, this is in color. I've never seen anything like this in my life." He said, "Why don't you get one?" I said, "I don't have any money." He said, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, I'm training to be a doctor." He said, "Come on in, doc. Just come on in. All you have to do is sign this little piece of yellow paper, and you can take it home." I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Absolutely." So I signed this yellow piece of paper, brought a brand new color television set to my dormitory, where there were already 6 of them anyway. And now I went back to the emergency room and I worked for another 24 hours. And this time I went to an automobile agency. I asked for the manager. I said, "I'm a doctor. I want a yellow piece of paper because I want to drive out with that automobile." And I did. And so my journey started. You know, we call human beings in our society, we call them consumers. It's a very ugly word to describe a human being, consumer. And that was my journey. Buying things with money that I hadn't earned to impress people that I didn't like, and wondering why all the stress. And shortly thereafter, I ended up in Boston at various institutions, training at medical schools or hospitals associated to Tufts and BU and Harvard. And soon I realized that I had learned to become a superb technician who knew everything about the human body, but absolutely nothing about the human spirit. And I realized that the word health and the word healing and the word holy are the same word. That healing really is the return of the memory of wholeness. And we have lost that memory. Today, if our world is sick, and it is, we have deep causes for the global instability that we see today. Pick up any newspaper and read the regional news and read the news around the world. And it's actually quite terrifying. There are 35 wars going on in the world at the moment. There is genocide in places like Somalia. There is rampant AIDS in the world. There is extreme poverty where 50% of the world lives on less than $2 a day, and actually 20% of that lives on less than $1 a day. We have extreme economic disparities. We have global warming. We have places, climate chaos. We have social injustice in many parts of the world where women are deprived of their rights. We have the abuse of children, child slavery in the world. This is a dismal, sick condition to be in. And what we do is, and I go to these occasions myself, we do fundraisers so we can feel a little good about ourselves. You know, it's a little money for mosquito nets, a little money for AIDS, a little money for some little program in some little village in Africa. And we think that we are making a difference. And what I'd like to say to you is that just as a physician, I started to realize that if you started to look at one problem at a time, then the problems were insurmountable. In fact, there were so many problems that it was just daunting to even start to tackle them. Have we made a difference in the last 30 years in the age-adjusted mortality from cancer? Have we been able to prevent minor holocausts and genocides in different parts of the world? Have we been able to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons or the research that goes on into biological warfare? And even if we try, it seems like it's a drop in the ocean because we are unable to even look at the magnitude of these problems and the multiplicity of these problems. And this is where I think it's very important for me to say to you that if we want to really address the several problems that confront humanity today on a huge level, we have to stop the way we think in the old paradigm. We use metaphors of violence even to solve our problems. The war on terrorism, which is an oxymoron. The war on drugs, the war on AIDS, the war on poverty. All wars, metaphors. And yet we live in a time when today the collective human creativity, the collective human intelligence, and even the collective human compassion and caring has enough not only to eliminate all these problems with creative solutions, but to actually offer an age of wisdom that Homer never dreamed of, that no visionary, no leader, including the Buddha, never dreamed of in the past. Because today, not only we have enormous capacities, we have the technology to make these intelligent, creative solutions available to everyone in the world. But in order to do that, we have to see a new kind of leadership. We have to see a critical mass of leadership in the world that looks at the world in a completely different way. We need not one, but many Nelson Mandelas, not one, but many Mahatma Gandhis, not one, but many Martin Luther Kings, not one, but many Mother Teresas, not one, but many Buddhas. And with the kind of capacity we have, just in this room, for example, with the kind of technologies we have through the web, through media, through music, through entertainment, through news networks, through educational facilities, if we do not harness this collective creativity, if we do not harness this collective intelligence, if we do not harness this potential for leadership, then we will have completely missed the boat. Human beings and human civilization today is at a crossroads. We can either go the way of the predator, which we have become. We are the predator on this planet. I was talking to an anthropologist friend of mine a few years ago, and he said to me, if insects disappeared from this planet, then in 5 years, all life on this planet would cease. But at the same time, he said, if human beings disappeared from our planet, in 5 years, life would flourish on this planet. Because we've destroyed our planet. Actually, I have to congratulate Canadians that they're some of the most environmentally conscious people in the world. If only some other countries would follow the example of Canada, even just south of our border here. But we have destroyed the environment. We have caused the extinction of other species. We are risking our own extinction at this present moment. And we have capacities and diabolical creativity that has the potential to really destroy this planet. So today we have little machines that we call our little Blackberries or Trios or cell phones, but they're little computers. And I can tell you that within 10 years or 15 years, the technology will be sophisticated enough that you could move electrons here, and from a remote location you could paralyze and hijack all the planes in the sky by interfering with air traffic signals. Or you could cut off electricity in a major city. Or you could interfere with pacemakers and respirators, or poison the food chain, or cause a nuclear plant to leak. This kind of technology is going to make conventional superpowers obsolete. Conventional superpowers pride themselves on their militarism, on their military technology. But what if a little handheld computer, about $20 in price in the future, could make these superpowers obsolete? Today, we live in a global culture, in a global environment, and the only thing that can make a difference in the world is a new kind of visionary leadership that says that we have to stop thinking in tribal ways, that our ethnocentrism, our bigotry, our hatred, our prejudice, our old habits of religious dogma and religious ideology, our extreme nationalism, are actually dangers to our very survival. Einstein, when he spoke of extreme nationalism, he said it's an infantile disease. It's the measles of humanity. Krishnamurti, a great philosopher in our own time, said nationalism, extreme nationalism, is a form of tribalism. That our great Erich Fromm, a great transpersonal psychologist, said nationalism in its extreme form is a form of incest. It's our idolatry, and patriotism is its cult. I wish Mr. Bush could heed those words, or other leaders in the world could heed those words, because our future depends in understanding that the whole world is our family. And we need leaders who can go beyond religious dogma and extreme nationalism and begin to see that the deeper problems of global instability are inextricably woven, which, by the way, was a message that comes from Buddha. He said everything in the world interdependently co-arises. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha said, don't look for cause-effect relationships, but look for the fact that every event is the interdependent co-arising of events that are happening in the whole universe. Can you look at a flower and can you see that the flower is also rainbows and sunshine and earth and water and wind and air and the infinite void and the whole history of the universe right this moment pretending to be a flower? Or in contemporary times, can you look at Hurricane Katrina and see that Hurricane Katrina is not just another natural disaster, but Hurricane Katrina is the disappearance of marshlands in the state of Louisiana at the rate of an acre every 24 minutes. These marshlands that acted as buffers to the fury of storms. Can you look at Hurricane Katrina and see that this is the denuding and the destruction of forests in Sri Lanka and India and all over Southeast Asia that comes from greed, that alters local weather patterns, that affects global weather patterns? Can you look at Hurricane Katrina and see it is also global warming and the denuding of shorelines and rampant oil consumption, that it is the Iraq war and it is the atrocities of the Abu Ghraib prison as well? That's what the Buddha, in his enlightened awareness, could pierce through the veil of illusion and see that if we enlarged our perspective, then the only solutions that we could have for our problems would come from a deeper domain of awareness, from our consciousness, from our spirit, from that part of ourselves that is inseparable from every other spirit, from that part of ourselves where we can actually get in touch with our soul, and getting in touch with our soul, recognize that the human problems and the global problems that we confront today need leadership that heals the rift in our collective soul at this moment in time. My first encounter of visionary leadership, or what I've since then learned to call the soul of leadership, my first encounter with this was when I was about maybe 6.5, 7 years of age, living in India. My father was an army doctor. He was stationed in a small town called Jabalpur in the central part of India. And we had read in the newspapers that our Prime Minister, who was the first Prime Minister of India at that time, Mr. Nehru, who was the heir to Mahatma Gandhi, that he was visiting our little town. There was going to be a new factory that was going to open, that was going to manufacture the first trucks in India. And so Mr. Nehru was coming to our town, and our family was very excited because we loved our leader. In fact, for 3 weeks, there was only one conversation at our table for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it was usually led by my mother, who said, I wonder what kind of sari I should wear for the occasion. And my father would tease her. He would say, there are going to be millions of people on the streets. Mr. Nehru is not going to notice your sari. And my mother, of course, had extreme self-confidence. She said, well, he's going to notice my sari and he's going to notice me as well. So on the day that Mr. Nehru was arriving, our little family, which was 4 of us, my little brother, who was then only 4.5 years of age, he's now the dean of Harvard Medical School, and he and I and my parents, my father dressed in his military uniform as an army doctor, and my mother wearing a beautiful pink sari, we went to the streets at 4 o'clock in the morning to witness the motorcade of our great leader, Mr. Nehru, the heir of Mahatma Gandhi. When we were on the street at about 4:30 in the morning, it was dark and there was no one there. But by 6:30, there were millions of people on the street. And when I say millions, you have to be in India to know that I mean millions. Not thousands, not tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but millions. People on treetops, people on window ledges, people standing on buses, on trucks, people hanging from trees, people jostling, all to see their leader. And finally at 9 o'clock the motorcade came, and Mr. Nehru's little jeep, it was a simple motorcade, he was standing in a jeep wearing his classic, what we now call Nehru jacket, white, a rose, beautiful red rose in his lapel, a motorcycle in the front, a motorcycle in the back, and very slowly the jeep turned the corner and went by us. And then Mr. Nehru turned and he looked at my mother and he took his little rose and he threw it at her. And the crowd gasped. And my mother, like a queen, stepped forward, picked up the rose, and held it to the audience. And they clapped. And she looked at my father and she said, Daddy, what did I tell you? Now let's go home. In that moment, I knew who the leader in our house was. So we went home. And there was one room in the house that was used as a meditation room and as a library as well. And she emptied the whole room of all furniture. And in the middle of the room, she had a table, a bare table, and on that table was a flower vase, and in that vase was a single rose. And for the next 3 weeks, people came to our house to look at the rose. This was the talk of the town. Mrs. Chopra was given a rose by Mr. Nehru. And they would step into the house and they would pause before they entered the room, and then they would take off their shoes, which is a sign of respect in India, and then they would tiptoe towards the rose, and then they would look at it in awe. No words were spoken. 10 days went by, and the rose started to fade. Another obvious principle of Buddha's teaching, that the relative is impermanent, no matter what it is. And so my mother had a party, and she invited all her best friends, and at the end of the party, she gave them all a rose petal, a faded rose petal. but this was the most precious gift that the people in our house could receive that evening. They accepted the faded rose petal as a precious gift, as an heirloom. And they would take their little rose petals and they would put them in a book and they would treasure it. And some of them said that this rose petal would be passed on to the next generation. And a few days later I asked my mother, I said, what's so special about those rose petals? And she said something which I have never forgotten. She said, in those rose petals is the soul of India. She said, in those rose petals is the dream, is the longing, is the aspiration, is the imagination of a country that has just been born into freedom. That the longings of the country were represented in the spirit of Mahatma Gandhi. And Mahatma Gandhi had almost transferred that spirit into the soul of our then leader, Mr. Nehru, who in turn symbolically represented the collective consciousness of a collective imagination, of a collective longing, of a collective aspiration, of a collective desire to reach beyond their capacities for good. And took me a long time to realize the significance of what she was saying to me. Because earlier when Noella introduced me, she said there are many definitions of leadership. Well, I'd like to offer you my definition of leadership. A leader is the symbolic soul of a collective consciousness. A leader is the symbolic spirit of a collective consciousness. A leader is one who can actualize not only his or her potential for maximum achievement, but maximum unfoldment of human potential, not only in himself or herself, but in the maximum potential for unfoldment of human possibilities in a collective consciousness, in a collective imagination. A leader can not only do that for himself or herself, but can do that not only for those that he or she leads or those that he or she serves, but for society as well. To unfold the potential of society, to unfold the potential of a collective culture, to unfold the potential of a nation, to unfold the potential of our human civilization. Because, as I said, that potential, once we begin to understand it, is absolutely beyond what our imagination can deliver to us right now. There's a great Sufi poem by the great Sufi poet Rumi. He says, when I die, I will soar with angels, but when I die to the angels, what I shall become you cannot imagine. And I think we need today the kind of leadership that will take us beyond the outer limits of our imagination, that in fact will deliver to us new raw materials for our imagination that lie not only within our personal souls, but in our collective soul. So very frequently when I talk about the soul, the spirit and all that, people say, what are you really talking about? We know what the mind is, we know what the body is, but has anyone ever proved that we have a soul? And if there is a soul, then where is it? These are questions that have been asked for thousands of years. And actually Buddha was one of the first people to address this question. When he spoke of interdependent co-arising, he said, your body is just recycled earth. Your circulation is recycled water, rivers. Your breath is recycled air, the atmosphere. Your thoughts are mostly recycled information, unless we have that absolutely original creative thought like that of an Einstein. Our stories that we tell each other are the same recycled stories. Our emotions are recycled energies that we derive from relationship. And even our personalities are dependent on each other. And he said, if you go to the deepest part of yourself, what traditional religions have called soul, you'll discover that there's no such thing as a separate self. That even your soul is a reflection of all other souls. And one day, if you experience that, then you will be filled with compassion, that you will be filled with love, that you will be filled with kindness, but you will also discover in that compassion, in that love, in that kindness, not as a moral injunction. Buddha was not a moralist. He left that to the hypocrites. But these attributes as your innate abilities as a result of knowing who you are. And in that knowingness, you will also discover the power of intention. Now I can realize that it was no accident that my mother's power of intention orchestrated the interdependent co-arising and the synchronicity of events that led to Mr. Nehru throwing the rose at her. I have no doubt in my mind today that when Rosa Parks refused to get out of her seat, that created an intention in a man called Martin Luther King, who said, I have a dream. And that was not a personal dream anymore. That if we can get in touch with this part of ourselves, here we have the power of intention. We have insight. We have intuition, which is a form of intelligence that is beyond the rational, that is contextual and relational and holistic and nurturing and goes beyond cause-effect relationships to see the inseparability and interwovenness of what Buddha calls our interbeing. He says we are interbeings that inter-arise in the inter-isness. Try and understand this interbeing, and you will see through the eyes of intuition, and you will see through the eyes of vision, and you will see through the eyes of creativity. So, before I go any further, I'd like you all right now to participate with me in just one simple twist of attention. So as you're listening to me right now, could you just turn your attention to who's listening, please? As you're listening to me, can you be aware of the listener inside you? So as you listen to me, turn to who's listening. And I hope you feel a presence. Because if you do, that's your soul. It's not your mind, which might be saying, that dessert was really good. Or I wish I'd gone to the bathroom before you started. Or some conversation. There's a consciousness in which that thought comes and then it goes. There's a consciousness in which an emotion comes and then it goes. There's a consciousness in which a perception of the world comes and then it goes. There's a consciousness in which the molecules of your body come and then they go. Everything comes and goes. Buddha said if it arises, it will subside. What is of the nature of arising is also of the nature of subsiding. But there's a consciousness in which all this happens, in which the coming and the going happens. And he said, hold on to that consciousness. It's your ticket to freedom. Hold on to that consciousness. It's the only part of you that's real. It was there when you were a baby. It's there now. It was there when you were a teenager. You had a different body, different mind, different emotions, different personality, hopefully. It'll be there when you're an old person. And it'll be there before birth and after death. It is what recycles as you. That you are not the roles you're playing, but the alert witness of the roles you're playing. It may be your destiny to play an infinity of roles. Nevertheless, you're not the roles you play. Right now I'm playing the role of this fellow who wrote the book. He's talking to you about it. When I think of a patient, I play the role of a doctor. When I think of my parents, I play the role of a son. When I think of my son, I play the role of a father. It's my destiny to play those roles, but if I can be the alert witness of those roles, then I'll see through the veil of suffering. And that was Buddha's quest. He said, there is suffering in the world. There is the reason why there is suffering in the world. There's a way out, and here's the prescription. He's the original doctor. And he does not go outside for religious dogma or ideology or belief to find the answers. In fact, he believes that belief itself is a cover-up for insecurity. We only believe things we're not sure about. I don't have to convince you to believe in gravity. You experience it, and you know how it works. Why should you have to believe in the mystery of the spirit when right now it is the animating force that creates everything that you call reality? Our consciousness differentiates into everything that we call reality. It's our thoughts, it's our emotions, it's our feelings, it's our relationships, it's our social interactions, it's our biology, it's our perception of the world, it's our environment, because the environment is the one we create. It's even our interaction with the forces of nature. So he said, get in touch with this part of yourself, expand it, and you will have not only gotten beyond your personal suffering, but you will be able to lead others beyond their suffering, and you will give birth to a world that we can all dream together. This was the essence of his leadership. And I have tried to take his story and the principles he enunciated in the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path. I have tried to contemporize them and bring them to the training of new leaders in society. As it was mentioned, I teach the Soul of Leadership course twice a year at Kellogg Business School and Northwestern University, but also to corporate and political leaders, so inclined. And we teach these leaders, first of all, to look and listen through the eyes of compassion and understanding. To look and listen through the eyes of the flesh, but also through the eyes of the heart. To look and listen with the eyes of the soul. We teach these leaders to practice the well-known skills of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the ability to be in touch with your own emotions, but also have the ability to have empathy and look at a situation from the emotions of another. Emotional intelligence is also the ability to skillfully and creatively manage relationship. So that's the second Actually, it's an easy way to remember. Remember this acronym, LEADERS, Leaders. So L stands for look and listen. E stands for emotional intelligence. A stands for action orientation. Leader is the one who acts, who takes the risks, who's a role model for action. It's not philosophy. You might as well go to India and live in a cave. Love and consciousness without action is meaningless. And action without love and understanding and compassion and consciousness is irrelevant. A new form of action that looks at creating worthy goals and looks at success as the progressive realization of worthy goals, both for oneself and for society. D stands for doing in awareness. Doing in awareness, because all the time our doing is outside there, but the doing in awareness is to ask ourselves the most meaningful questions of our existence. Who am I? What do I want? What's my purpose? What's my contribution? What are my peak experiences? Who are my heroes and heroines in history and mythology and religion? What are my unique skills and how do I use them to serve my fellow human beings or to lead society? The next E, Leaders, stands for empowerment. Empowerment from a level of self-actualization. What Abraham Maslow said, self-actualized people are immune to criticism and to flattery, both, and yet responsive to feedback. That they feel beneath no one and superior to no one. That they are fearless because their internal reference point is not their skin-encapsulated ego, but their soul. And finally, S stands for synchronicity, that mysterious ingredient where you're in the right place at the right time, where preparedness meets opportunity. And all great leaders always say, I was lucky, or God was on my side, or I happened to be in the right place at the right time. But they're all speaking of the same thing because they got in touch with their soul, and their soul is the place where synchronicity occurs. Consciousness is that domain of awareness where everything is instantly correlated with everything else. So in the short time I had, and I'm just looking at my perception of change right now, I wish to cover the main and salient points of why we needed and why we need at this critical moment in our development as a human species a new form of leadership. Jonas Salk said the next phase of our evolution has to be survival of the wisest. That wisdom will become the new criterion for evolution, and wisdom is that knowledge which nurtures the ecosystem, the chain of being, the web of life. And we are at this moment poised to take that leap or risk our extinction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deepak, for that deeply inspiring speech.